So a little introduction. In 2019, I stopped working at a busy state school in East London, where I found that I was catching quite a lot of infections and getting a little bit unwell. And I took a bit of time out to focus on my health a bit more, and also to develop an interest that I had started getting involved with actually through the PCD networks, which was research. And I think research is a really important thing for the world of PCD, because without research, we won't get better treatments, we won't understand how this condition affects us. And so it's a really important component of what we know about the condition. And so the title of this talk is "That's Rare, I Doubt You Have It." And some of you might find that this phrase is a bit familiar to you. It's something that often we are told as people with PCD. To give you a bit more of an overview as well, I have done this research because I noticed that when you look at the literature that is published at the moment, it's very quantitative. So it's very numbers based. It's quite technical. It's often about genetics and science. And actually what I thought was that there seems to be a bit of a gap in what we understand about the experiences of people with PCD. And actually these experiences are all very diverse. They're different to all of us, but they're really important. And so the hope is that perhaps this research will allow us to understand those experiences a bit better and help all of our people that are supporting with PCD in various different corners of healthcare and the charity sector and beyond to understand what it's like to live with this condition. So this study, it was a master's dissertation, so it isn't a huge study. But basically it involved flexible conversations with 12 adults that have PCD. There were 8 women and 4 men, and 3 had situs inversus, 2 had some form of heterotaxy, so not a complete mirror image of their internal organs, and 7 had their internal organs in the normal position. I should just mention that situs inversus refers to having all of your internal organs in the mirror position. The age range was 18 to 66, so quite a big age range. I had 5 participants from South Asian backgrounds and 7 participants from white or white other backgrounds. And just a note on this, I did use the government definitions of ethnicity, but in order to protect patient confidentiality and our community confidentiality, I have amalgamated these broad groups. So within the white group, there is people who define themselves as white English, Scottish, Welsh, white Irish. There's people that define themselves as white mixed or white other. So that just gives you a bit of an overview there. Similarly, in the South Asian group, we have people who define themselves as Pakistani, people that define themselves as Bangladeshi, and so on. The median age of diagnosis was 15. So it's worth noting that this is a little bit older than the what we would consider the sort of median or average age as well, actually, in PCD. And not all of the people that I spoke to received specialist care at one of the centres. There's a lot of geographic spread, with some of the participants actually living in either Scotland or Ireland as well. Now, does this matter? To me, no, because these are 12 unique stories. So what this research doesn't try to do is to generalize the experience of all people with PCD. So when I tell you about some of the stories that I've heard through these interviews in this research, it's really important to remember that this is not all people with PCD. These are some unique stories. Okay, so something that I noticed through the literature is actually it captures a very limited view of people's lives with PCD. So it often captures it through the hospital clinic. And the hospital clinic is really good for things like diagnosis, treatments, seeing infections, although that is limited as well. And we'll talk a bit about this in this presentation. But it doesn't quite see how people with PCD interact with space and place, or how PCD impacts people's working lives, or how people conceptualize their identity with PCD, or whether PCD is a part of their identity. And it doesn't really explore how PCD might affect or not affect our relationships with others. And this actually is a very messy picture. So we like to think of everything in small, tidy little boxes, but actually what I found was that these relationships between these different themes, these different domains, is actually very, very messy indeed. So this led me to separate the themes into types of self. And actually, when you're talking to people with PCD, they often describe different states within this. So the first type of self or state of self that I've divided it into is the diagnosed self. Now, diagnosis is actually the first thing that most people talk about when they are describing how they came to have PCD. And in sociological terms, a diagnosis for patients, I use that word as with my little inverted commas, a diagnosis is permission to be ill. So a lot of people in this study, they said, I always knew that I had something wrong, or I always had a cough that I couldn't explain. Some people see it as this enigmatic thing. It's a mystery. I had issues my whole life and no explanation for it. And so for many people with PCD, a diagnosis is a label that actually gives answers. And there's really mixed feelings among all the people that I spoke to about how they took that diagnosis. For a lot of people, it was a very positive thing, but very quickly, it brought along a big toolkit of things that they had to learn. And that's where it gets really, really interesting. So let's just look at this quote here. So for years, I was like, I'm not unwell. I'm just making it up in my head. If all these doctors are not finding a reason for it, it must be me. So you can see this person here, he was actually, he went to the doctor several times and he tried to get a diagnosis. He went when he was 16 and he said, I think it might be this really rare disease called PCD. And the doctor said, nah, it's not that. And so he was going back and forth constantly to the point where he said, actually, I'm just going to give up going to the doctors because they don't believe me. It must be in my head. And so not getting a diagnosis can actually lead people to have a lot of self-doubt and to question it themselves. And often emergency events are what cause or kind of instigate a diagnosis. So this person says, blood was pouring out of me. I was like, what on earth is happening? They had to call the ambulance. Went to the hospital. Again, they just put it down to a lung infection. Gave me antibiotics. Then it happened a third time about 6 months later when I was 16. The doctor who saw me that time was amazing. She was like, no, this isn't normal. You need to get investigated. So for this person here, it's actually an emergency event that triggers this getting a diagnosis. And this was quite a common theme that occurred in the interviews. So people said, actually, the way I got diagnosed was something really bad was happening. I had a really bad infection. And finally, sort of someone took me seriously. And this is quite a sort of distressing thing for a lot of people when they're talking about it. Often got quite emotional because it just shows sort of where it has to get to for them to get that diagnosis. So I'm just hoping my slide will move on now. So becoming diagnosed, I think in terms of the research that I have done, broke down quite quickly into these ideas of barriers. So barriers getting diagnosed, such as being turned down or being told or made to feel like it's just in your head. Also trivialization. So often people described going to the doctor repeatedly and they said, it's just asthma. It's just asthma. And then they think, oh, there's nothing worse. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just asthma that I've got. There are also facilitators, though, to getting diagnosed. And often these were emergency events or chance encounters. And chance encounters, with this idea of potluck, is a really important theme that came up quite frequently. This idea of meeting one person who happened to know someone who knew about PCD. This idea that actually it's really down to chance was something that a lot of people described. And so once people get their diagnosis, immediately they're confronted with treatments. And when I was thinking about how this features into our identity as people with PCD, often this became an idea of the negotiated self. And I'm going to explain this a little bit in a second. But basically, treatments generate work. They are work for us. And in sociology, there's a term called body work, where the body becomes an object of labor. It's an object of other people's labor, so it's their jobs to work on your body. But in PCD, it's also an object of our own labor in that we have to constantly do these treatments. And so the reason I've described it as the negotiated self is that through a lot of the conversations I've had, people really have to negotiate with themselves about how they do their treatments and what they do. And it's something that is negotiated because you have to fit it in with all the other things in your life. So it's something that you have to really kind of work and constantly work towards. It's a bit like a sculpture, you know, you're this artist that's got to kind of keep it in the shape and the form that you want or you think it should be. And so treatment is a big theme across all of these interviews. We know that treatment is or adherence, this idea of sticking to treatment, is quite bad in all across chronic conditions generally. So there's when you've got conditions that need a lot of treatment and that need continuous sort of upkeep, we know that this idea of adherence or doing that is considered quite poor. In other respiratory conditions, like cystic fibrosis, it's also considered relatively poor. So people are not doing what they have been told to do 100%. And we know anecdotally in PCD that it's considered not great. So I've often heard conversations where you know, people will say, actually, I'm meant to do physio this many times a day, but I don't. And the medical staff know this as well. And lots of people in these interviews had mixed relationships with their treatment. So some had a really good routine and they had a really positive relationship. And then others had a slightly less positive relationship. Now, in the PCD Live that I did, there was a little poll where we asked people, you know, how do they ever lie about doing their treatments when they're talking to their doctors, or how do they like their treatments? Do they get on with them? Do they ever miss treatments? And again, that poll was as mixed as some of the testimonies in these interviews. And so when I asked people about their treatments, there were some clear themes. Some people had this idea of futility, and futility literally just means, you know, what's the point? What's the point in doing it? And so one person said to me, after the surgery, so this person had had sinus surgery. After the surgery, for 10 weeks, I did steroid spray and drops and another spray, Nasonex, and a sinus rinse. And I did it for quite a long time. I was quite surprised. And he's saying that he's quite surprised that he managed to keep doing it for a long time. I did that and I went back to the doctors and I still couldn't smell anything. And so I say, what, so you stopped then? You kind of stopped? And he was like, yeah, pretty much. For me, I get like, if it's not making any difference, then why am I doing it? So this idea of, if it's not making any difference, then why am I doing it? And actually that's not always, although that is a really common feeling for a lot of the people that I spoke to, it doesn't always relate to the actual reason that the treatments are recommended. So in sinus rinses, treatments are recommended because they can also clear the bacteria out of the, you know, the infections out of your nasal passages. So although a lot of people were saying, well, I do my nasal rinses and 10 minutes later, my sinuses are full again, I just can feel it all there. There are underlying reasons that perhaps these treatments are recommended, but there's a disconnect between that being explained sometimes to us. And here are some more views about this idea of what's the point. So someone said, it didn't get better, but it didn't get worse. Or, I can't be bothered. I'm missing 3 buses just standing here doing sinus rinses. And so for this person, they've got this kind of weighing up of doing their treatments or all the other things that they need to be doing. And that treatment is taking that time away. And someone else said, they didn't have a very strong relationship with their treatments. They used to skip their treatments a lot. And they said, it's not harming me. Otherwise, I'd need IVs more often and I'd be in hospital more often. And again, this is a really interesting view that a lot of people had. So some people who didn't do the treatments as they were told to by their doctors, or they skipped a lot of them or rarely did them, sometimes they had quite regular IV antibiotics as well throughout the year. And they said, well, actually, you know, it's not harming me, otherwise I'd be in hospital more. Even though they were in hospital sort of throughout the year, that was their normal for them. And so that they were able to rationalize that and say, well, that's normal, it's not getting worse. And so these are some quite strong kind of views that you can see that fit into our relationships with treatments. And another theme we had was concealment. So some people said that they lied quite a lot to their doctors about, or their nurses or physios about doing treatment. So someone here says, I stopped doing it in the mornings years ago, probably a decade ago. I still tell the doctors I do it twice a day. And someone else said, I do physio once a day, but I know I should do it more. And I said, do you actually do it once a day? And they go, I hold my hands up. I tell my doctors I do it more than I do. So why is this? And there are a few reasons about this, actually. So some people felt that they were going to get a lecture. So, and I asked one of the participants who said that they always lie to their doctors about it. I said, why not just be honest? And they said, I just want to avoid the lecture. Other people felt guilty. And so these sorts of feelings, I think they're really important for us to recognise. And actually, they're a potential future theme that we can look at addressing. Now, not everybody lied. Don't worry if you're watching this and you're one of our PCD physios. Not everybody lied, and lots of people found that the treatments were very useful. So there were some people that had really proactive and positive attitudes towards treatment. And anecdotally, I noticed that the people that had really positive attitudes were more often people that were diagnosed as adults. And for them, this related to themes of control, because they'd had this kind of childhood of being really, really ill. They had nothing to control their symptoms. And suddenly they were given this tool that allowed them to control those chest infections and control those symptoms a little bit more. So this participant here says, everyone minds doing the treatments. Who wants to spend their time doing this stuff? Not me. But if it means I can control how much I'm coughing and how many infections I have, then yes, it's positive. Do I like spending all this additional time doing this stuff? No, because nobody else my age or your age is doing this stuff. So everyone recognizes that treatments are a pain, and everyone recognizes that treatments are a burden to being able to do other things. Now, some people found that the meta processes, which is what I've described it as here, so not the treatments themselves, but the things that you have to do the treatments, the meta processes of treatments were a pain. And I enjoy using this image because I think it says all you need to know. So this on the left is the electropneumostat, which is basically a nebulizer that was used, as you can see, between 1935 and 1942. So over 80 years ago. And this is on the right-hand side, the Clement Clarke Medix nebulizer, which is a blue square box. And you'll see the dimensions at the bottom, and you'll see that the electropneumostat weighed 3.2 kilos and the Clement Clarke weighs 2.7 kilos. So actually in 80 years, these nebulizers have not really developed in their bulkiness. And this is really annoying for people with PCD. And a lot of people found that actually their nebulizer was a pain to them doing their treatment. It became a barrier. So someone here got a new nebulizer. So there are some modern ones which are very light. They weigh about 300 grams, and they're much faster to distribute the medication. And so this person says, I think getting a new nebulizer really motivated me, because when it used to take me 15 or 20 minutes every morning, I'm not getting up 20 minutes earlier to nebulize. So it's not getting done. Then if I'm doing anything after work, it means I'm not nebulizing in the evening. So I'm not getting it done. Then the next thing you know, you haven't nebulized for 7 days and you're like, well, I haven't died yet. And then you don't nebulize anymore. The e-flow was like 3 or 4 minutes and job done. I told the guy who was teaching me how to do it, when he followed up a couple of weeks later, I was like, no word of a lie. This has changed my life. So that's quite a powerful testimony there from one person who'd experienced both types of nebulizers and the impact that these had had on their treatment. And I think this is something that's really important to bear in mind as we sort of continue to talk about PCD and this idea of adherence, doing the treatments that we're meant to do or that we're told to do. Actually, these processes have got to be easy enough for us to do. We've got to be able to do them as quickly or as accurately as possible. And so I think that's another interesting theme that we could look into in the future. Right, that was a timely cough. So the next theme is the language of infection. So the language of infection is probably my favorite thing that came up in this research. And in terms of how infection comes into our idea of what our selves are and how we see our identity, I've called it the anticipatory self. So the idea behind this is that most of us feel like an infection is coming. We know that we're going to get an infection at some point. And so it's this idea that you're always kind of on edge, like waiting for this infection to arrive or trying to avoid these infections. And that becomes a really interesting part of people's conversations. And every participant of the 12 people that I spoke to considered infections to be inevitable or unavoidable to some extent. And for some, the idea of self, so, this is me and this is my identity, went from this is me, I'm Lucy, I'm a person with PCD, to this is me, I am PCD. This, when you have an infection, it becomes all encompassing and it kind of takes over other competing ideas of yourself. So there's a disconnect in the language. And that's something that I think is really, really fascinating. So in 2019, a team of our wonderful PCD experts put together a European consensus statement. So this was a document where experts in PCD across Europe agreed what an infection is. So when you're having an exacerbation, what that is. And so how do you know that as a person, that person is having an exacerbation or an infection? It's the same thing theoretically. So they said an increased cough, a change in sputum color or volume, increased shortness of breath, fatigue or malaise, new or more blood in the sputum, and temperature. And so you had to have 3 of these to for that to flag as a sort of exacerbation. And importantly, what they did say was it doesn't matter how long you've had these for. So it doesn't matter, if it's a day or a week. Now that was completely different to how the people in these interviews described an infection. For them, everybody said, well, I give it a few days. Time was a really important thing for understanding whether you have an infection. This idea of comparative biographical severity, I'm just going to explain that a bit now. So some of the people that I spoke to, they would compare every infection that they have or had to a really bad infection at some point in their past. So they'd say, I was really ill, but it wasn't as bad as this one time. And so they had this like frame of reference that everything else was subsequent to that was measured against. And space and place was a really important theme in the language of infections. So everybody described infections more or less in their lungs, and they slightly or sometimes would describe it as sinuses, but less so, or perhaps when we had those conversations, they described it in less severe ways. But often people didn't really think about ear infections as being a big component of having an infection. And people gave gradients to that type of infection that they have. And that's why I keep stumbling over the words here of exacerbation, infection, flare up. People had different words to describe how they were feeling. And I felt as an interviewer in this process, I related to that. I have PCD myself, and I know that sometimes I have an infection, but it feels mild, and I have an infection, it feels bad. And so a mild one, I often find that I will say, oh, I've got a bit of a flare up. But actually, if you were looking at it against this consensus statement, it's sort of hard to differentiate. So here's one person's experience. They say, I couldn't get up the stairs, breathless, just constantly coughing, constantly bringing up loads of mucus, way more than normal. I cough a lot, but this time I was breathless. I just couldn't breathe. I got the exact feeling I had when I had pneumonia. And obviously I thought it was that, but it cleared up really quickly, in a way. Now, some context to this person. This person was in hospital for 3 months with pneumonia in their 20s. They were in hospital for 3 whole months, and they were very, very ill. And when we're talking about, when I say to them, okay, so, what's it like when you get an infection? This is what they're describing. They're describing an experience where they can't get up the stairs. And they say, I had that same feeling when I had pneumonia, but this one cleared up really quickly. So it's this idea of actually this was less bad because I had this really bad one many years ago. And another thing that I've spoken about is timing. So timing is really important to when people define whether they have an infection or not when they have PCD. So this person says, I really have to convince myself that I need to take those antibiotics. I think, oh, maybe I'm just a bit tired. And 3 or 4 days will go past, a couple of weeks start going past, and then I'm like, oh no, this is a full-blown infection. So again, this idea of how long do you wait? When is a good time? And that was very kind of difficult for people to make a decision on, to make a call on. When do you start the antibiotics? And this person describes this perfectly. They say, any change worries me. And they do say, jump straight on the antibiotics. But sometimes it's just been a bad day and the next day I'm fine. So when is the best time? Because they say you should do it straight away. But if I was doing it, I'd be taking them once a month, maybe. And a lot of people said this. A lot of people said, well, I always give it a little bit of time because you don't know how it's going to pan out. And so I think this is a bit of a disconnect in the language that we use between people that have PCD and then people who treat people with PCD. There were also some really interesting and important infection questions that lie beyond this idea of what is an infection and when do we take antibiotics? And this is the idea of microbiology. So lots of you will be familiar with coughing some sputum into a pot and sending it off, and it gets tested. Some of you might know that these tests often come back with particular bacteria that have names. And so some questions that kind of came up from doing these interviews was, does it matter what we grow? Do we as people with PCD need to know? Do we want to know? And what do we, as people with PCD, do with this information? And what I want to stress here is I don't have clear answers. I have personal opinions, but I don't have clear answers. And so I think, again, this is just more questions for us to work through as a community. But here are some of the findings that did come up. So microbiology actually linked a lot to this idea of power dimensions and what we know about ourselves. But it also had this kind of intersectional element. So here there is one of my participants from a South Asian background said, I remember calling up the specialist hospital and asking them what was going on. And they were like, yeah, you're colonized with Pseudomonas. And I'm like, okay, well, can you get me in the hospital and sorted now? And they were like, oh, there's no point. You've been colonized for 5 or 6 years. I was never told this. From all the letters I've gone through, I never remember seeing it. So this participant felt that actually information had been withheld from them, and that this idea of they hated this term colonization, this idea of having this kind of chronic infection was really stressful to them, or not an infection necessarily, but a chronic growth of bacteria, so bacteria that was always present in the lungs. This was really annoying to them because they felt that maybe something could have been done about it when it first came up, but they didn't know. And so another issue that came up a lot was the language of infection in terms of not understanding what was being said to them, or to us. So, and not understanding if it's significant what is being said to us. So someone says, they said the bacteria, they said the bugs I was growing were odd bugs. Well, what does odd bugs mean? Someone else said the bacteria in my lungs is tropical. I think they described it as. Another person said, I had this bug associated with this weird outbreak in America that caused meningitis. So again, this idea of this like foreignness to it, this like alien, the bug is alien, it comes from far away. The language of infection was really fascinating here. Another person says, I think since I've been colonized, God, I hate that word. I think it's there and it's there to stay. And another person said, they've stopped treating it now. It's just one I have to live with. And again, there's this idea of this person didn't quite understand why they used to be treated for this bug that they grow, but they don't now. Now, what we have here is not right or wrong, but just a slight disconnect in how we communicate between each other. And I think this is an issue that we could sort of keep working towards clarifying. But place was another thing that was really important. So the source of the infection mattered to people. This idea of where did I pick that up from? Can I locate it? Can I trace it back to where I got it? And a lot of the time, we just didn't have answers. So one more thing now. So this is going to be my final slide. I'm just trying to remember if I got this far in the last talk, but space, place, and the sites of disease. So the idea of space is so important to how we talk about having PCD, and it kind of generates this idea of a porous self. Where did I pick something up? This idea that things kind of come into us uninvited, and that we can catch things and transmit things. And this kind of plugs into this idea of riskscapes and healthscapes. So riskscapes is kind of what the word sounds like. It's ideas of places that you would go that might be unhealthy. And so I often ask people, in these interviews, what do you consider a healthy place and what do you consider an unhealthy place? And people had really varied responses. So lots of people had definitely thought quite closely about how they interact with spaces. So some people said, oh, I'm always keeping an eye out for ways to avoid infections. Another person said, oh, I avoid, places where things that grow in damp places are. Someone else said they avoid public transport. And certainly since COVID, lots of people said that they had changed their behaviors because of the threat of COVID. They didn't want to get it. They thought it would be or will be a dangerous infection to them, which is sort of a talk. If you want to know more about COVID and PCD, listen to the PCD live that we did on Monday, the 29th of November, and you'll hear more there. But lots of people that I spoke to had changed things about their lives since COVID. So they changed jobs, they changed their work routines. They said, actually, working from home has really been a positive impact of COVID for me because I can minimize my exposure to other people, particularly when I'm in the office and everyone's coughing. Lots of people saw fewer people and they felt empowered about drawing out boundaries about who they saw and what context they saw people. So some people said that actually they no longer want to go to a busy pub to see friends, or they do it on their terms. And some people avoided busy places. All people that I spoke to said that they had fewer infections during COVID-19. And just anecdotally or observationally, we're hearing this quite a lot at PCD Support UK, and the hypothesis is that perhaps it's because people were seeing fewer people, you're interacting with less, you're exposed to fewer infections. So space and place was quite interesting in PCD, and it generated this idea of Homo economicus, so this idea of the economic man. So this principle is that as people, as agents, as people in general, we make rational decisions, and those decisions they're self-interest oriented, so they're based on the best outcomes for us. And what we try to do is we maximize utility, so we're very efficient in the decisions that we make to generate that best outcome. And so this came up quite a lot, actually. So people said, actually, I will take risks, but I'm taking risks on my terms. This idea of allowing us as people with PCD to become gatekeepers of our risk. And part of this, the rationale behind this was that a lot of people I spoke to felt that actually people understood respiratory illness a little bit better. So the general public understood more about catching bugs, they understood more about hygiene. And actually this gave some people the kind of empowerment to say, actually, I don't want to do this, and I'm happy to do this other stuff. So it's a kind of idea of allowing us to act with maximum kind of efficiency about how we interact with space and place as people who have PCD. Now, I am going to leave this one here, and I will start my next talk on the Goldilocks principle. But just to recap what we've spoken about today, we've spoken about the diagnosed self, so how getting a diagnosis is often the first point at which people think about themselves as someone with PCD, and that diagnosis is often positive because it brings answers, but it also is negative because it comes with this big treatment burden. We've spoken about how treatments have to be negotiated. We negotiate them with ourselves, we fit them into our lives, and that is a constant process of work, and it's something that we continually have to manage to greater or lesser extents. We've spoken about the anticipatory self, so getting infections and feeling like you're always going to get one, and working out what is an infection when you do get one. And we've spoken about the language of infection. So how do we communicate this? How do we understand as people with PCD what an infection is versus how clinically is an infection described? We've spoken also about space and why the geography of our environment, why the people and places that we interact with have become conceptually quite interesting since, particularly since COVID has emerged. And all of this comes together to create some variations of self and our identity as people with PCD. In my next talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of knowing, looking, and believing. So looking well, but feeling ill. And this idea, which I've termed the Goldilocks principle. I'm also going to talk about intersectional issues. So people's experiences when they perhaps share cultural backgrounds that maybe stigmatize having an illness. And I'm also going to talk about experiences of, we've spoken a little bit about with the people I've interviewed about experiences of fertility and how people view that, and also gender and how people view that. And a final thing that we'll also discuss in the next talk will be about this idea of the leaky body. This, you're constantly producing phlegm and you're constantly trying to mitigate that. So for now, that will be it. But I look forward to seeing you all in 2022, and we'll do the next one live and hopefully not have to re-record it. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. And do feel free to email any questions that you have on this stuff to me at chair@pcdsupport.org.uk.